This video is about topic 4.5, feedback. Organisms, be they unicellular or multicellular, are all exposed to external stimuli in their environment. Stimuli can include light, salinity, temperature, pH, the presence or absence of chemical compounds, and more. Additionally, the stimuli present in an environment are never static. They are in a constant state of change. This means that the maintenance of a relatively stable set of internal conditions is important for a cell or entire organism to continue functioning properly. Homeostatic mechanisms vary in their complexity based on the complexity of the organisms. Those that are single-celled generally have more simple systems for maintaining internal balance as compared to those that are multicellular, with many cell and tissue types being coordinated. Also, for some organisms, certain internal conditions are strictly maintained, while others simply mirror the conditions found in the environment. For those conditions that are regulated, feedback mechanisms are used to react to changes in environmental stimuli. Feedback mechanisms are essentially cause and effect systems, the affector and the effector. In the feedback mechanism, it is the resulting effector that determines how the system will be regulated. These mechanisms fall into one of two general categories, each of which will be explained separately: negative feedback and positive feedback. Before looking at each of these systems in detail, it is important to keep in mind that those terms are not used to describe something that is bad or good, detrimental or beneficial. Negative feedback mechanisms are important in maintaining homeostasis. They act to respond to a stimulus that disrupts the system by resetting it, returning it to its original condition. The original condition is called the set point, the status that the mechanism is trying to maintain. A classic example of negative feedback, illustrated in every biology textbook, is the homeostasis of body temperature. For humans, the average temperature set point is about 37 degrees Celsius. Within a few tenths of that degree set point, homeostatic negative feedback mechanisms are not engaged. But what if body temperature increases too much beyond that range? That increase triggers a set of responses like sweating and dilation of blood vessels in an effort to decrease the body's temperature. The initial stimulus was an increase, and the response works to counteract it. Conversely, were body temperature to drop below the set point, shivering and constriction of blood vessels would act to warm up the body and prevent further heat loss. Just as before, the initial stimulus led to a response that works to counteract it. Another example of negative feedback involves the maintenance of an appropriate amount of sugar in the blood. In humans, the set point for blood glucose is about 90 milligrams of glucose per 100 milliliters of blood. But after eating, the amount of glucose in the blood rises, leading the pancreas to secrete the hormone insulin, which is involved in removing sugar from the blood and storing it in the liver and other body cells. The initial stimulus was an increase, and the response works to counteract it. If blood glucose levels drop below the set point, perhaps because it's been a while since your last meal, the pancreas responds by releasing glucagon. That hormone triggers the liver to release into the blood some of the glucose it has stored. Again, the initial stimulus led to a response that works to counteract it. Feedback inhibition is a type of negative feedback that is important in shutting down a metabolic pathway. This is useful in ensuring two things. One, that there isn't a waste of raw materials, the reactants, and two, that an excessive, unnecessary amount of product isn't made. The essential amino acid threonine is important in its own right as one of the 20 that are used to build proteins. But it can also act as the initial reactant in a metabolic pathway that produces another amino acid, isoleucine. Striking a balance between the cell's need of threonine and isoleucine is the goal of this mechanism. Were the cell to use all of its reserves of threonine to make isoleucine, there would be not enough of one and way too much of the other. So, as the concentration of isoleucine grows and becomes sufficiently high, it binds to the allosteric site of the metabolic pathway's initial enzyme. As we all know, a molecule binding to an enzyme changes that enzyme's conformation, in this case, to a shape that inactivates it. This process is reversible, so as isoleucine is released from the allosteric site and used up by the cell, that necessitates the resumption of the metabolic pathway. The key takeaway about negative feedback, regardless of the example, is that a negative feedback mechanism is one in which the response counteracts the initial stimulus. In contrast to negative feedback, positive feedback involves a response which increases, not decreases, the effect of the original stimulus. A really great non-scientific example that makes this point is how interest in a bank account works. When you put an amount of money into an interest-earning bank account, eventually, thanks to that interest, there is more money in the account. That now higher amount of money gains even more interest, increasing the total balance of the account, enabling even more interest-earning potential. So, what biological example exists for positive feedback? A great one involves childbirth. At the end of a pregnancy, the hormone estrogen makes the cells of the uterus sensitive to oxytocin. Oxytocin triggers the uterus to contract and stimulates the placenta to produce hormones called prostaglandins. They, in turn, lead to more oxytocin release and even more contractions. This escalation of hormone release and contractions continues until the baby is expelled. A similar series of events occurs as fruits ripen. A gas called ethylene is largely responsible for initiating the ripening process. When a single fruit starts to produce and release the gas, other nearby fruits are stimulated to produce it. This sets into motion a wave of ethylene production, resulting in all fruits undergoing the ripening process. A scientific yet non-biological example can be seen in climate change. Sea ice, because of its light color, acts to reflect solar radiation back out into space. But as the atmosphere warms, ice melts, exposing more of the darker water beneath it, preventing some of the sun's rays from reflecting. Since the water is now absorbing energy from the sun, it warms, melting sea ice even more. The main idea is a positive feedback mechanism is one in which the response promotes or amplifies the initial stimulus. That concludes this look at feedback. Thank you for watching, and take care.